Hello, welcome to Culture Wedge. Here on this channel, we address problems with today's culture, what we see in society today, things that influencers are telling the young people that are going to be the next in our society to make important decisions, to make important life decisions, and that are going to be running our country. We've talked about a couple things so far, but I want to get to the core of the problem that we're facing in today's society. What made the people of today's society that we see, what made them be so self-loving? What made them be so narcissistic? It seems that exaggerated feeling of self-love, of self-importance is absolutely crazy.
Come on, man.
Well, let's start with how it ended up that way. What we see is whenever these generations were being raised, the kids were pretty spoiled. Not all of them. Remember, whenever I'm saying this, I'm not talking about all the people of a certain generation, but many were totally spoiled by either one parent or both parents for different reasons. Now this, along with other stuff I'm going to say, is been proven logically and scientifically for different reasons. So if you want me to back that up, at some point I will, but I can promise you it's the truth. So the first thing was spoiled kids. Next was lowered standards. Generations became those that would hand trophies to every single person that participated in a sporting event, in whatever kind of competition. Instead of those who finished on the podium or finished first being acknowledged as the best, everybody was patted on the back, given a trophy, rewarded for just being there. That, along with other things that are similar, have created a lower standard in generations in society. People no longer strive for excellence as much as they did in the past. And if they do strive for excellence, it's not really where they should be looking for it, to say the least. So that's one thing. And then there's the lack of virtue. Or maybe a better way to say it is the lack of good virtues. We've been talking about virtues at church. I've started an introductory sermon on Christian virtues today, and we'll be looking at each one individually in the coming weeks. Now, I listed some things that are virtues of today's society, and not all of them are so great. In fact, some of them are exactly the opposite of what we're told in God's Word. Pride is one of them, for sure. Sensuality is one of them, in a sense. So that, along with others, are virtues of today's society, or the lack of good virtues, or virtues that are recommended to live by in order to have a fulfilling and productive life. So this society of self-love, narcissism, pride, acceptance of certain people, idealism, and ridiculous amounts of self-love have gotten us to where we are today, beginning with their childhood. Then as they went to college, they were raised with all of this social junk throughout college that they were taught. It was absolutely ridiculous. In ethics class, they were taught about feminism, women's rights, women's oppression, racism, instead of being taught about moral values, virtues, such as what's listed in the Bible: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, so on and so forth. Time was spent studying problems. Time was spent studying social policy and not morals. And so that's created the society we have today, focusing on problems instead of focusing on private, personal things that are worth improving. And that also leads to today's culture, the decisions, the virtues, whatever, being based on feelings or being based on emotion or being based on impulses, especially if that impulse is emotional. And this idea itself has created huge problems. Now, I could spend a lot of time going through all of them, and I may make another video talking about some of the crazy stuff that has risen from social policy based on emotions, based on a person's feelings. And I might add that those feelings are usually quite selfish and prideful. So they don't benefit everyone, even though it's portrayed to be so, portrayed to be that way. But I'm only going to touch on maybe 3 things today that we've seen rise out of this society driven by your feelings, driven by social policy, instead of personal attributes, instead of personal and private ethics. One thing that we've seen is glorifying, or some people will say justifying, obesity. And in some ways, justifying or glorifying being overweight. This is absolutely ridiculous. I don't really know when this movement, this self-acceptance movement started, but it started out as something relatively calm and relatively sensible, but it continued to get worse to where now we see things like this Cosmopolitan magazine with Tess Holliday on it she's obviously not in shape. She may be healthy, but she's obviously not quite in shape. And it says here on the bottom right corner of the Cosmopolitan magazine, a supermodel roars, Tess Holliday, when the haters, wants the haters to kiss her butt. Yeah, the haters. Who are the haters? Well, most of the time the haters are people that would prefer for other human beings to be healthy, to be in good shape. Something that seemed relatively common sense not so long ago, and still does for many today, but not these their decisions are based totally on their feelings, their emotion, their sense of self-pride and self-love. Now, these people truly think that being in this kind of shape, being in this kind of health is perfectly fine, and they have pride in it. But I would like to show you this article from Forbes talking about obesity and the pandemic and how being obese affects affects what can happen to you throughout the pandemic and with coronavirus. Right here, key facts, it says, through analysis of Johns Hopkins University virus mortality data and the WHO's data on obesity, the World Obesity Federation, a nonprofit associated with the WHO, calculated that 2.2 million of the pandemic's 2.5 million global deaths were in countries with high levels of obesity. The report found death rates were 10 times higher in countries where more than 50% of the population is overweight, pointing to the UK and the US as examples. The UK has the third highest death rate in the world, which is 184 deaths per 100,000, and the fourth highest obesity rate, with 63.7% of adults classifying as overweight, closely followed by the US, which has 152.49 deaths per 100,000 and 67.9% of the population living with obesity. Vietnam, on the other hand, has the lowest COVID-19 death rate in the world, 0.04 deaths per 100,000, and also reports the second lowest rate of obesity, 18.3% of adults. There have been several studies and several things obvious that being obese is a very, very, very large factor in you struggling or even dying from COVID-19. That's not my words. That's what experts say. If this isn't a good enough example to show us that living in this way and priding yourself in it is not good for you, I don't really know what is. I can't say much myself. I am overweight. I used to be obese until I got diabetes, but I'm still overweight. I'm still not in the best shape, but I try myself to eat healthily, and I know many others do. But the idea that we shouldn't strive to lose weight, but instead be proud of it and emphasize it and maybe in some cases even glorify it is absolutely ridiculous. So this is one thing about today's culture, one smaller thing about today's culture that is solely based on feelings or emotion and bringing those lower standards in and the lack of virtue of basically wanting to be a better person that is just absolutely ruining people's lives today. Something else we're going to talk about that is usually based solely on emotion or feelings is trans kids. Wanting to allow kids who are even under 10 years old to have a sex change, being given estrogen, whatever, in order to have whatever kind of sex change they want. Now, when a kid is so young that they can hardly understand the difference between a boy and a girl, can they really understand and decide for themselves what they want to be whenever they grow up? Now, I know a boy and a girl can tell their differences by colors they like, by toys they play with, by their hair, whatever. But obviously it goes much deeper than that. And yet, parents will decide that their kid needs their gender changed because of those things I just mentioned. Toys they like, colors they like, whatever. Feelings about who their friends are, who are they closer with, is it boys or girls, these sort of things. Parents will take those maybe somewhat obscure attributes of a girl or a boy, mostly boys, and decide that their child needs a sex change because of it. And so this child will basically go through chemical castration, and it will permanently affect them for the rest of their lives. Now, when we talk about this this being based on feelings or emotion, who is deciding for the child in this case that they should undergo this kind of chemical castration? Is it the child necessarily that can speak for itself and make decisions on what's going to affect them for the rest of their lives? Or is it the parents, the adults, that are making this decision? Well, I believe it's the latter, and it is based on the feelings of the parents. I don't really care what your child does, or nor does many people care what your child does whenever they're so young they don't know what sex is, or they don't know what makes them their sex. It doesn't matter what they do. Whenever I was little, I played with girls' toys. And I know many girls who were, when they were little, played with boys' toys. How in the world does this justify things like this, petty little things like this? How in the world does this justify the changes people are making today? Well, I'll tell you, the people who are really making the changes are the parents. They're the adults. And this is based on feelings, based on emotion, also based on other factors that solely benefit the parents. This is absolutely ridiculous. And this problem also leads up to problems we see in today's culture, in today's society, of we have teenagers or young people who were boys transferring over to being girls, and then they grow up, and one thing that happens is they get into competitive sports. And it is absolutely unfair for the girls who are already in these competitive sports, high school, college, it doesn't matter, because these trans girls can come in and absolutely kick their butts. Trans girls have taken records all across the world. I can think of several. And I want to show you an example of a trans girl in Australia playing handball. And tell me what you think. Do you think this is fair or not? So, what did you gather from that? The girl absolutely throws the others around playing this game. It's obvious. She's 6'2", 220 pounds. Meanwhile, those around her are 4 to 6 inches shorter and, of course, much smaller. And this isn't something brand new. This isn't something that's just happening in Australia. It's happening all over the world in places that allow it. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Changes like this will also ruin our society in the future as long as we allow it to keep growing, keep pushing it, as many do today. And real quick, I want to touch on something that is also driven by feelings or emotion, your own thoughts, your own views. Of course, thinking that those are the only things that are correct. We have a seriously dishonest media. We have seriously dishonest influencers online, wherever, and we have seriously dishonest personalities like celebrities pushing things like what I've just talked about, and other things that are absolutely not true or do not have any basis for society today and what we've seen in the past. And a big problem with this that you could attribute to a lot of the decisions being made is something called, and this is Latin, argumentum ad novitatem. And what that means is claiming that something that is new or modern is superior to the status quo, based exclusively on its newness. Now, there's another phrase similar to this, which is argumentum ad populum, which in other words, if it's popular, it must be right. These are two logical fallacies, but yet, if you really take a look, people use them all the time. Letting trans girls into women's sports and letting the trans girls kick the women's butts is not right, is obviously not right to most people with common sense. But unfortunately, a lot of people are lacking that common sense. And so because it's new and because it's different and because it's popular in certain circles, it makes it right. Within that echo chamber that the left is stuck in, it's right because it's new and it's popular to them. And this applies to several other things in our culture today, and it is absolutely ridiculous. Today's modern culture, postmodern culture, is absolutely anti-traditional, and it's created a severe problem. I understand that there are traditions that are bad, but when it comes to virtues, whenever it comes to standards for society, many things that we have held traditionally are based on biblical values, are based on values that we've held as Americans, which is also based in biblical values in many fashions. But people hate America in today's culture, and they reject the traditions that our country has held for as long as our country has existed. And so this argumentum ad novitatem and this argumentum ad populum rules now whenever it comes to things we see in culture, things that people emphasize, so on and so forth. So the glorifying or justifying or being positive about obesity is obviously not good for people, and it's going to influence the nation of the United States that is already majority overweight, majority obese, to become even more that way, because the recognition that we need to do better goes away as our standards keep getting lowered and lowered. Also, the changing sex of your kids, which leads to ruining competition sports in women's mainly, will keep happening, will be emphasized, in even though there may be a small number of cases, those cases will be emphasized and it will become normal and more normal, especially when we have legislation pushed by Democrats who only care about their back pockets, who only care about getting reelected. They don't care whether it's morally wrong or not. They just want you to vote for them again. So they're going to push this absolutely crazy legislation, allowing a child that is less than 10 years old being chemically castrated. And there are other things that go along with that I don't have time to talk about right now. Things like suicide and seriously enhanced risk of suicide once they get older. And of course, what we saw starting a long time ago and has gotten worse up to this point is the dishonest media, dishonest influencers wherever it can be found, wherever the influence can be found, and dishonest or just absolutely crazy celebrities that push across this stuff like this with the mindset of that argumentum ad novitatem or argumentum ad populum. If it's new and if it's popular, well, it must be right. No, that's not true. To be honest, that's never been true unless something became tried and true. Unless it over time became well known as being the truth, it's probably not true right now just because it's new. That applies to all three of those things: glorifying obesity, allowing kids to have sex change, so on and so forth. All of these things that I've talked about, the common sense is mainly the opposite. The common sense is holding to virtues that we've held as Americans for a long time. It is having the right standards, setting the right bar for your kids, for you personally, no matter how old you are. And it's also raising your kids in a fashion that they won't throw a tantrum as a 30-year-old when someone disagrees with them, that they won't be offended by if a person looks at them wrong. Ridiculous stuff like this. Please raise your children in a way that they have those standards, that they have those virtues that are necessary for a productive and a quality life if you do have kids. If you don't, I recommend you don't listen to advice unless it checks all the boxes of common sense, especially if it checks the boxes of Christianity if you're a believer. And if you're conservative, if it checks the boxes of conservatism or little l libertarianism, if you so choose. So, that's it for my rant today. I could go on more and more subjects, but I don't have time or enough brain power to go through all of them without my IQ dropping by several points. So, thank you for watching today. This has been Culture Wedge. Remember, we're driving a wedge into this seriously wrong and stupid echo chamber of today to break it apart and bring common sense, conservatism, and even Christianity back in today's culture. Thanks.